American musician, singer, and songwriter Taylor Swift, at age 34, recently became the world's first music industry billionaire whose primary source of income is their music, as opposed to side businesses, work, and royalties in adjacent or completely disconnected industries. A lot of that wealth has stemmed from her incredibly successful and ongoing, as of the day I'm recording this at least, Eras Tour, which began in March of 2023 and which is her 6th tour and by far the biggest in scope, scale, and success. The Eras Tour by itself has surpassed $1 billion in revenue, the first tour to ever hit that milestone, and it's had all sorts of interesting direct ramifications and repercussions, like bolstering Swift's music sales and streams, but also indirect ones, like creating a sort of economic weather system wherever these tour stops are planned. It's been estimated, for instance, that the Eras Tour contributed something like $4.3 billion to the GDP of the United States, and the Wall Street Journal dubbed these economic impacts Taylornomics, as the combination of travel, food, entertainment, and other spending surrounding her tour dates, folks coming from all around the world to visit the relevant cities, attend the concert, and spend on those sorts of things while in town, has all had a meaningful impact, legible even in the huge scale numbers of national income figures. Swift, then, has been having quite the moment, following the several decades of work in this industry leading up to this tour, and the swirl of activity, economic and cultural especially, around her Eras tour stops have made these events central to the collective consciousness, grabbing lots of airtime and water cooler talk wherever she shows up because of how much of an event each of these stops are. And notably, they have been very well reviewed in terms of the performance, the sets, the planning, everything. So it would seem that the attention being focused on these shows is not superficial and reflexive. It's the result of having put together something pretty special for people who are willing to spend to attend that kind of event. It maybe shouldn't come as a surprise, then, that there may be people out there looking to garner attention for themselves and their causes who see these events as an opportunity to do exactly that. 3 sold-out shows in Vienna, Austria, were canceled in early August due to a plot by what seems to have been several teenagers looking to kill as many people as possible outside the tour's local concert venue. An investigation into this plot is ongoing, so there's still a fair bit we don't know, but what has been divulged so far is that 3 people have been connected to the plot and detained. The main suspect is a 19-year-old who planned to use knives and/or explosives to kill as many of the 30,000 or so people who gather outside the show venues each night as possible. And another 65,000 people would have been inside the venue, so that is a lot of people. And there's a lot of potential for stampede-related injuries and deaths, alongside those that could be caused with knives and bombs. And it's been divulged that he, alongside 2 other suspects, a 19-year-old and an 18-year-old, they were inspired by the Islamic State group and Al-Qaeda, the 18-year-old, who is an Iraqi citizen, apparently having pledged himself to the Islamic State. Propaganda materials from both terrorist groups were found at the 17-year-old's home alongside bomb-making materials, and he was hired just a few days before being caught by a company that provides some type of service to the concert venue. Specifics about what said company provides have not been officially divulged yet, but the theory is that this job was meant to give him and his accomplices some kind of access, allowing them to do what they intended to do more effectively. There were a lot of disappointed Swift fans in Vienna, who in some cases spent thousands of dollars just getting and staying there for the concert, only to be told that it was canceled. Most of the response from those affected in this way seems to be relatively upbeat, though, considering the circumstances. Pretty much everyone breathing a sigh of relief that this plot was not pulled off successfully, which could have resulted in something like what happened at Manchester Arena in 2017 when an Ariana Grande concert was attacked by an Islamic extremist with a bomb who killed 22 people and injured more than 1,000. Swift's representatives have said that her next concerts, scheduled for between August 15th and the 20th, are still on the books and ready to go at London's Wembley Stadium, which will close out the European leg of this record-setting tour. London's mayor has said that the local authorities are prepared for whatever might happen, having learned a lot from that aforementioned Ariana Grande concert in 2017. What I'd like to talk about today is a bout of violent rioting that broke out in the UK recently, which is loosely connected to Swift and her music, though only adjacently, and is primarily focused on the roiling topic of immigration and its British discontents. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. Learn more about Let's Know Things, subscribe to receive free email updates, and or become a supporter to receive monthly bonus episodes at letsknowthings.com. At the tail end of July 2024, there was a knife attack in Southport, a town in northwestern England, in which 3 young girls were killed and 10 other people, 8 of whom were also children, were injured, some very badly injured. This attack targeted a Taylor Swift-themed yoga and dance workshop that catered to children ages 6 to 11, 25 of whom were in attendance, hence that large number of young victims. And the adults who tried to stop the attacker were all themselves injured, in some cases critically, and the assailant was only ultimately halted when a pair of police officers managed to subdue him. The person behind this attack and those murders is a 17-year-old British citizen who was arrested at the scene, and whose identity was initially concealed from the public because of how privacy laws work in the UK related to minors. They tend not to divulge identifying details when crimes are committed by people who are legally children, though in this case they ultimately decided to do so for reasons that I'll get into in a moment. Thus far, there is not a clear motive behind the attack. The attacker has been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and was apparently deep in the midst of some kind of self-imposed isolation, leading up to his apparent decision to take a taxi to this workshop and kill a bunch of children. He has been charged with possession of a bladed article, 10 counts of attempted murder, and 3 counts of murder, and his trial date is currently set for the end of January in 2025. This attack is currently not being treated as a terrorist incident, though again, no clear motive has been established, and there's a lot that's not known, and likely quite a bit that has not been publicly divulged yet. This knife attack unto itself led to a lot of headlines and attention because of just how brutal and horrible it was. But in the aftermath of the attack, possibly because the attacker was not named, again because he was a minor, rumors and then outright misinformation began to spread around less than legitimate news entities in the UK and across social media platforms and messaging apps like Telegram, many of them suggesting or directly alleging that the attacker was someone he was not. A false name was given to him by some of those spreading these rumors, and even in cases when a name was not misattributed or fabricated, he was alleged to be an immigrant seeking asylum, which is also incorrect. His parents are from Rwanda, but he was born in Cardiff and is thus a British citizen. Within days, these rumors and this mis- and disinformation, this accidental and purposeful spreading of mistruths, began to reach a fever pitch. The zone flooded with patently untrue claims and narratives, which is why the police decided to release the attacker's name publicly on August 1st. It was going to happen within a week or so anyway because he was turning 18 on the 7th, so the idea was to get ahead of that impending forced divulgence and to try to temper some of that false information spread within facets of British society in the meantime. Most of these false stories, though, hung on even after officials made this information public, and to understand why, it's important to understand what a political force anti-immigration sentiment has become in Britain over the past few decades. Now, the British are not alone in this, especially in wealthier countries. Mostly, but not exclusively, conservative politicians and parties have been making hay with claims about folks from other countries coming into their territory, taking their jobs, gobbling up their social services, and changing their culture into something those who came before feel like they can no longer recognize. Part of this is just the consequence of society's changing, being reframed into something devilish and wrong. Part of it is the reframing of stagnating economic conditions as something that is being done to their societies by outside forces, not being caused by uncontrollable macro variables like pandemics and controllable variables that are being mismanaged by those in power. Part of it, though, is related to real-deal demographic shifts as folks flee from repression and violence and economic deterioration and dangerous climactic happenings in less wealthy parts of the world to those that are currently not suffering from those things, or at least not to the same degree. Thus, we see waves of people showing up on the US's southern border, all hoping to get into the country, legally or otherwise. And the same is true of European nations with Mediterranean coasts, and as is the case here, people arriving legally by ship and plane and train into England, but also illegally, often in makeshift boats crossing the channel. And people who arrive in this way are arrested and filtered into a system that often moves quite sluggishly, and the government puts these new arrivals up in hotels or other housings for the duration of their processing at the government's expense. From the perspective of someone in a smaller British town, then, where the economic conditions are not much better than those of a similarly sized town in a much poorer country, since London is the only city in Britain doing really well economically right now, this looks like a bunch of people from elsewhere who do not belong, taking resources that should go to them, to the denizens of these smaller towns in that country, should be spent on their housing and healthcare, should be making jobs for them. And the ones that are allowed to stay continue to take those resources, leaving a lot less to go around, again, in circumstances in which it already feels like there's not anywhere near enough. No chance for growth, few job opportunities, and diminishing value in the social services that they've been promised, that they are told their taxes pay for. These are potent political topics then, because in some cases, these are real deal issues already, and in others it can be useful and effective to stoke fears that this could happen in the future if we allow these foreigners to keep flooding across our borders, legally or illegally. In the UK, the Conservatives, the Tories, they've used this issue as a very effective lever, and at the height of fervor about this topic, they almost seemingly accidentally led the country to a successful Brexit referendum in 2016, leading the UK to leave the European Union, in large part because this would allow them to set their own immigration policies, separate from those of the EU, which are much more open in terms of movement between their member nations. All of which I think helps explain what happened next, following the knife attack, and the torrent of false information that flooded the zone following that attack, which included all sorts of claims that the attacker was an illegal immigrant, that he was a Muslim, and that if nothing else he was a black teenager who had brutally murdered several young British girls. On July 30th, a crowd in Southport gathered outside a local mosque and started causing trouble and making threats based on that incorrect information, saying that the attacker was a Muslim. The police showed up to keep the peace, and the protesters attacked the police. They set fire to a police van, they damaged the mosque, and in the process they injured more than 50 police officers and 3 police dogs. This initial group of protesters was formed around a nucleus of people who belonged to the English Defense League, which is a far-right anti-Muslim organization, and members of Patriotic Alternative, which is a neo-Nazi group. Similar protests that became riots popped up in cities across the country in subsequent days, and amidst all the resulting tumult, a police station was set on fire in Sunderland, and more mosques, alongside businesses and homes owned by people who were purported to be, often incorrectly, immigrants. They were also damaged and destroyed. Hotels housing asylum seekers were attacked, and something like 750 of these anti-immigration rioters have been arrested for causing damage and threatening bodily harm so far. The nature of these riots changed on August 7th, when a protest populated by the same sorts of people as were seen at the other ones, mostly anti-immigrant, neo-Nazi and far-right folks, was met by a group of anti-racist counter-protesters that dramatically outnumbered them. The police helped support the peaceful anti-racist protesters, and since that day, most of these would-be riots have been quelled by oversized groups of counter-protesters augmented by a police presence. Before that tactic arose, though, several cities saw a handful of nights in a row of destructive rioting by those far-right groups, many of them pillaging and burning shops and attacking strangers and the police. And the government has gone out of its way to really throw the book at folks they've arrested, handing down significant punishments to some of the instigators of these riots in particular, while also publishing their names and faces in an attempt to embarrass and make examples of them. As of the second week of August, we are still seeing periodic attacks on mosques and attempted protests and riots by far-right activists here and there across the country, though they are happening a lot less frequently than in previous weeks, and peaceful anti-fascist, anti-racist protests have become a lot more common in response to those attempted riots, but also unto themselves, separate from those riots. There are several ways of looking at what happened here in response to the attack and in response to the attack, in response to the riots. One narrative of all of this is that far-right politicians and ideologues in the country have attempted to convert a truly horrible event into something that it wasn't, for the purpose of regaining some of the power that they lost with the last round of parliamentary elections. It's been alleged by the new British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, that these riots were instigated by far-right troublemakers like Nigel Farage, who was one of the key proponents of Brexit and who has recently re-emerged in British politics as the leader of a vehemently anti-immigrant, further right than the Conservative Party within the country. Farage and similar anti-immigrant leaders flooded the informational zone with disinformation and nudge-nudge wink-wink innuendo that implied this was one of the consequences of allowing immigrants into the UK, and that, according to Starmer and other government leaders, led to some of this violence and destruction. Those leaders have even hinted that it might be prudent to clamp down on those sorts of social media posts and other false claims because of the real-world consequences that can follow from them, though that hint has been met with skepticism and worry from free speech advocates, so it may not actually happen. It's also been alleged that foreign agencies like those in Russia have been helping amplify these false claims as part of their larger effort to sow discord and to augment the potency of reactionary and violent groups in countries that they want to influence. And folks who have aligned themselves with global conservative movements, like Tesla CEO Elon Musk, have been accused of doing the same. Musk himself sharing a lot of misinformation related to this attack and to the riots that followed on the social network that he bought, formerly Twitter, now X, and he clashed with the new Labour government on that network while saying that he believes a civil war is inevitable in the UK. So we could look at all of this through the political leverage lens, and there's a lot of power to be gained by successfully attaching reins to this sort of movement and amplifying trouble for those in power, if those in power are your political rivals. We might also look at this through the lens of actual on-the-ground issues, though. There was a piece in the Financial Times recently in which it was posited that how we perceive these riots and the people sparking and perpetuating them will tend to depend on whether we subscribe to the rational actor or the riffraff model of riot interpretation. The rational actor model says that people who riot are doing what they do because of real-deal grievances that they cannot seem to get addressed in any other way, while the riffraff model says rioters are basically low-life people who have nothing better to do, and or they like to mindlessly give in to the animalistic urges to belittle and attack and maybe even kill those who seem different from them and theirs. And all they are looking for at any given moment is an excuse to give in to those urges. Most social scientists today support the former, the rational actor model, suggesting that even people who lean toward violence will tend to keep those behaviors tamped down most of the time, and they only let them out at moments in which they feel like there is no other way to get themselves and their grievances heard and addressed. And that's true whether we're talking about people of color rioting because they feel like they're being unfairly and violently targeted by police, or when it's mostly white British Christians who feel like they are being elbowed out of society by Muslim immigrants and various other people of color. that folks like Farage might step in and try to ride this kind of wave then might ultimately be less important than identifying a pressure valve that'll allow these sorts of grievances to be worked out and addressed in socially positive and legal ways. Government healthcare infrastructure in many of these areas is stretched to the breaking point. Social safety nets are unraveling, and years of conservative-instigated austerity measures have left these and other social baselines way below where they were in recent memory. And the messaging from the Conservative Party has been that immigrants are to blame, not their good and logical and responsible monetary policies, though most independent data and analysis says that that's not the case, it's the other way around. Starmer, as the head of the new Labour government, which won the last election in a landslide, booting the Conservatives from their perch for the first time in a very long time, has the opportunity to address these issues then, but it's likely he will have to do so in such a way that the actual problems are addressed, providing better funding for these services, helping to stimulate more economic activity so there are enough and high quality enough jobs for everyone, and ensuring there's enough immigration so that the systems that rely on folks coming in from elsewhere, which is especially true of the nation's healthcare system and its construction industries, among others, so that those can function properly, while also addressing some of the superficial, seeming issues, like cracking down on illegal immigration, which probably is not the core problem that it's been promoted as by the conservatives and those to their political right, but it is still an issue, and it's something that Starmer has said he will crack down on, and that could help the perceptual value of the other things that he does to try to address these issues as well. It currently seems like he might aim to grease the wheels of the immigration system so that folks applying for citizenship are processed faster, which would mean fewer resources expended putting them up in the country while they are waiting to see if they can stay, which would possibly help free up government resources while also representing a kinder model for those who are otherwise left in limbo for long periods of time to see if they are allowed to stay in the country. Whether this can be framed and communicated in a correct and beneficial way by the Labour government so that it appeals to those who are worried about immigration, that's an open question though, as it's possible that anything other than a hardcore lockdown on the borders and a denial of new immigration requests, which would cause even more chaos in some aspects of the country's healthcare and other immigration-related services probably, anything other than that hardcore version of a solution might seem like non-solutions, even if they do technically solve some of the underlying problems that rioters have been complaining about. The book I'd like to recommend this week is called AI 2041, 10 Visions for Our Future by Kai-Fu Lee and Chun Chu-fan. This book is written by somebody who knows a great deal about practical on-the-ground AI, the former president of Google China, and a pretty well-known writer of speculative science fiction. And the book is basically made up of 10 different stories of what a world in which different permutations of artificial intelligence become common, what that world might look like. So one way to look at this is just that it's a collection of short science fiction stories, but another is that it's a collection of short science fiction stories that are heavily reliant on speculation by folks who are in the know about both what is happening now and what is likely to happen over the next couple of decades, based on where the state of the art in artificial intelligence actually is. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of AI 2041 by Kai-Fu Lee and Chun Chu-fan. You can subscribe to receive email updates, find show notes, and other such content, and support this show financially, receiving additional bonus episodes as a thank you at letsknowthings.com. Learn more about me and my work at Colin.io. Subscribe to my other news-focused podcast, One Sentence News, wherever you get your pods, or at onesentencenews.com. And say howdy on social media. I'm at Colin is my name on Instagram and Twitter, and Colin Wright on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Colin Wright, and I'll talk to you again next week.